Flight attendant shouts at a black teen girl. Then she makes one call and the plane is grounded. She was merely a teenage girl seated quietly in her first-class spot, holding a valid ticket. Yet the flight attendant didn't even inquire. Instead, she raised her voice, questioned her, and compelled her to relocate to the back of the plane, all while silent passengers looked on. No one intervened or spoke up. However, when the girl picked up her phone and sent a brief message, everything shifted. Within moments, the engines were turned off, the captain halted the flight, and federal officers were en route. What the airline failed to realize was that she wasn't not just any passenger. She was the reason the entire flight would be grounded. Before we dive into the story, share in the comments where you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy this type of narrative, be sure to subscribe and activate the bell icon so you won't miss the next one. She sat quietly in seat 3B, her hands folded over a navy blue backpack resting on her lap. Her name was Tasha, a 16-year-old with a serene expression and weary eyes. She had boarded early, her ticket safely tucked inside the sleeve of her hoodie. This was her. It was her first time flying solo, and despite a hint of nervousness, she felt a swell of pride knowing her godmother, Evelyn, had gifted her a first-class ticket after she excelled in a science program. The seat was spacious and comfortable. The cabin exuded a fresh scent, and a sense of tranquility enveloped her. She remained silent, gazing out the window as the runway passed by, her headphones draped around her neck and an unopened book resting on her lap. Passengers continued to board. A man in a suit was quietly speaking on his phone across the aisle, while a flight attendant assisted another traveler. Their suitcase was a few rows down when an older woman appeared, sharp-faced and rigid in her stance. Her name tag read Ms. Carter, and the sound of her heels echoed on the cabin floor as she made her way up the aisle, glancing from seat to seat. Her pace slowed as she approached Tasha, and she came to a complete stop for a moment. Her eyes initially held a smile, but it vanished as she scrutinized Tasha more closely. "You're in the wrong seat," Ms. Carter stated, her tone flat yet loud enough for others to overhear. Tasha turned to her, confused. "No, I think this is my seat," she replied softly. Parker's eyes narrowed. "This is first class," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Where are your parents?" The question reverberated through the cabin, causing a few passengers to turn their heads. Tasha pulled her boarding pass from her pocket and held it out. "I'm in 3B, she replied. Ms. Carter took the pass, scanned it quickly, and raised an eyebrow. She looked back at Tasha as if something was amiss. This must be a mistake, she thought. There's no way. She caught herself and then hardened her voice. "You need to move now." Tasha blinked. "But I have a first-class ticket," she protested. Once more, with a bit more assertiveness, Miss Parker stood her ground. She leaned slightly forward, placing one hand on her hip. "I don't know how you got this ticket, but you're holding up the boarding process. You need to take your things and move to the back." Her voice had shifted from firm to dismissive, cold and loud. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact while others watched as if it were a scene from a television show. Tasha felt her face flush with embarrassment. She wanted to speak up and explain, but it was clear that no one would come to her aid, so she simply stood and grabbed her belongings. She grabbed her backpack and made her way down the lengthy aisle toward economy, her head bowed and her chest constricted. Tears were not an option. In the rear of the plane, she located an empty window seat, settled in, and set her bag at her feet, gazing out at the tarmac. Ms. Carter's voice echoed in her mind, sharp and accusatory, as if she had done something wrong. But she hadn't. She had adhered to every rule and earned this trip, feeling a sense of pride. Yet none of that seemed to matter now. She took out her phone and opened her messages, her fingers moving swiftly. Gradually, she urged me to vacate my seat. She typed out a message claiming I didn't belong. Now I'm at the back, and she hit send before locking her screen. She was uncertain of her godmother's reaction and whether anything could be done. As she gazed out the tiny window, one thought crossed her mind. This flight wasn't going anywhere. Not if Evelyn had a say in it. Tasha's phone buzzed just moments after her message was sent. She looked down, anticipating a brief response. But instead, she found just two words. "What happened?" Her stomach churned. She could nearly hear Evelyn's voice emanating from the screen. Steady, calm, yet undeniably serious. Tasha paused, then typed slowly, her thumbs pressing more firmly than usual against the glass. The flight attendant made me move. She didn't believe the ticket was mine. She said I couldn't be in first class. The message bubble lingered for a moment before another appeared. Short, sharp, and clear. Flight number. Tasha reached into her hoodie once more and retrieved the crumpled boarding pass, her fingers trembling slightly now, not from fear, but from In the whirlwind of recent events, she entered the flight number and pressed send. The response arrived almost instantly. Stay where you are. Do not speak to anyone else. I'll handle it. Tasha gazed at those words for what felt like an eternity. She had witnessed her godmother resolve issues before, at family gatherings, during meetings, and even once in a school predicament. But this situation felt unique. They were already on the airfield, taxiing for takeoff. What could she possibly do now? A peculiar sense of calm enveloped her, not because she thought everything would resolve itself effortlessly, but when Evelyn said she would take care of it, she truly meant it. At the front of the plane, Miss Parker stood in the galley, sipping water from a paper cup, a satisfied smile playing on her lips as she straightened a stack of napkins. The other attendants moved around her quietly, most avoiding her gaze. One of them, a younger man named Daniel, finally stepped closer and lowered his voice. Hey, about the girl earlier, he began, but Miss Parker interrupted him. What about her? She had the ticket, Daniel said. I saw it. It looked real. Miss Parker chuckled softly, noting that many things appear genuine. After 15 years in this field, one learns to detect when something is amiss. Louise shifted in her seat, feeling uneasy. She wasn't causing any issues. You're in the wrong seat, Miss Parker snapped. I fixed it, Louise replied, remaining silent otherwise as she stepped back. Miss Parker took a final sip of her water and discarded the cup, a smug look still on her face. Little did she realize the chain of events she had just initiated. She was unaware that Tasha's godmother was more than just a successful woman with connections. Carolyn Hayes, the director of aviation safety at the Federal Aviation Authority, was not one to tolerate humiliation. Back in the cockpit, the pilot's phone buzzed with a direct message from ground control, marked urgent. He answered the call, frowning as he listened. The instructions were unequivocal. Hold the plane. Do not taxi to the runway. An official compliance issue had been flagged concerning a passenger on board. Sir, his co-pilot inquired, but the captain shook his head slowly. We're not going anywhere. Yet, he announced over the intercom, ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to remain at the gate a little longer due to a minor delay. We'll update you shortly. A soft groan rippled through the passengers. Most accepted the news without a second thought, as delays were commonplace. No one questioned it, but for Tasha, it was the first indication that something was amiss. For Ms. Carter, it marked the onset of an unforeseen storm. Tasha remained still in her cramped economy seat, fixated on the blinking seatbelt sign above her. She didn't move or speak, absorbing the message from her godmother's voice reverberated in her mind repeatedly. Stay where you are. I'll handle it. She sensed a change in the atmosphere of the cabin. Some passengers were glancing at their watches, while others murmured to each other, curious about the delay in takeoff. Yet no one directed their gaze at her, nor did anyone speak. Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, Ms. Carter glided down the first-class aisle with an air of forced elegance, offering a tight smile here and a polite nod there, all the while feigning that everything was all right. She paused at seat 3B, now vacant, and adjusted the headrest, as if that could undo the events that had transpired just moments before. One of the passengers, a woman adorned with silver hair and a pearl necklace, leaned in slightly and inquired, "What's the holdup?" Miss Parker responded with a meticulously crafted smile. "Just a minor delay. It should be resolved shortly." She quickly moved on, not pausing for a response. Inside, she felt the initial stirrings of unease. She glanced at the cockpit door, but remained still. Something felt off. She adjusted the folded blankets on an empty seat, attempting to keep her hands occupied. In the cockpit, the captain drummed his fingers on the armrest. He had just finished a second call, this time from someone he rarely heard from directly, a representative from the FAA. It wasn't a routine call or a simple inquiry. The words lingered in his mind. A complaint had been filed by the director. Carolyn Hayes is inquiring about an onboard passenger, and you are to stay grounded until further notice. She demands immediate answers. The captain, with over 20 years of experience, had faced engine issues, airspace routes, and even unruly passengers. But he had never received a call from someone like Carolyn Hayes. Her name held significant influence, not only in aviation, but also in government oversight. If she instructed to stop the plane, it was imperative to comply. The voice had stated, she'll need to clarify why a first-class passenger with a valid... The ticket was taken from her seat without reason. The captain hung up, stood, and opened the cockpit door. "Miss Parker?" he called, his voice steady yet terse. She turned around. "Yes, Captain?" "Step up here, please." Passengers nearby looked up, and Miss Parker's smile faded. She smoothed her blouse with both hands and walked toward the front. Inside the cockpit, the door closed behind her. The captain remained silent for a moment, then gestured to the headset where a voice from the ground was already waiting. She placed it on her head, confusion evident in her. "Eyes on Miss Parker," the voice began. "This is Robert Mitchell, FAA Operations Manager, speaking on behalf of Director Carolyn Hayes." She froze. "We've been informed that a passenger, Maya Thompson, was removed from her first-class seat under your instruction. We are currently investigating the validity of that action." Ms. Carter's voice faltered for a moment. "She didn't appear to be a first-class passenger. I was following protocol." "Did you scan her ticket?" "I looked at it." "That's not what I asked." The silence that followed was palpable, the voice on the line waiting for a response. "You didn't adjust your tone. Did you confirm her boarding pass with the manifest or the ground agents before taking action?" Ms. Carter's hands became clammy. "No, but I made a decision based on the circumstances." "You made a decision based on her appearance," the voice stated flatly. The captain stood to the side, arms crossed, choosing not to intervene. Miss Parker swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry and her chest was tight. "You are to return to the passenger immediately," the voice continued. "Escort her back to first class and apologize clearly in front of the other passengers on this flight. Would not proceed until that was completed." And afterward, she spoke in a barely audible whisper. The voice responded, "We'll be waiting when you land." The line went silent, and Ms. Carter removed the headset with trembling fingers. For the first time in her career, she felt lost about how to mend what she had just damaged. Ms. Carter exited the cockpit slowly, her face drained of color and her steps unsteady. The confident demeanor she had earlier had vanished. She avoided making eye contact with the first-class passengers as she walked past them, her hands nervously fiddling with the edge of her uniform with each step. As she walked down the aisle, the atmosphere felt more oppressive than before. The silence of the cabin weighed heavily on her. Everyone was in a state of anticipation, waiting for the flight to commence, waiting for an explanation, though the true reason for the delay remained unknown. As she approached the economy section, her gaze scanned the rows until it settled on Tasha, who sat quietly by the window. The girl hadn't shifted. Her backpack was neatly stowed under the seat, arms folded across her lap, staring out the window, calm on the surface, yet her mind was elsewhere. The atmosphere was charged with uncertainty as she sensed a shift in the cabin. The exchanged glances among the crew members heightened her awareness, and now Ms. Carter was approaching her seat with an awkward demeanor. "Ms. Carter," she said, crouching slightly and managing a strained smile, "it appears there has been a misunderstanding. I would like to escort you back to your original seat." Tasha slowly turned her head, her expression inscrutable. She remained still and silent at first, causing Miss Parker's strained demeanor to waver. "I apologize for the confusion," she quickly added, "and for any inconvenience caused." Tasha blinked and slightly tilted her head in confusion. "I see," she said softly. Miss Parker nodded, her face tightening. "There was an error in seating." Tasha didn't raise her voice. Her words were quiet yet firm. "You checked my ticket, you saw the seat number, and you still told me to move." A few nearby passengers turned their attention towards them. The individuals who had previously heard the disturbance now listened intently, their curiosity heightened. Miss Parker shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her hands tense at her sides. I may have misjudged, she said cautiously. Tasha observed her for a moment before glancing down at her phone. She typed a brief message and pressed send. She's here. Says it was a mistake. A reply came back almost immediately. Make her say it. Tasha tucked her phone back into her pocket and stood up slowly, turning to face Miss Parker, who straightened up as she did. I'll go back, Tasha said, her voice unwavering. But I want to know something. Miss Parker tensed. Why did you assume I didn't belong in that seat? You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket, just me. The question lingered in the air, intense and focused. Miss Parker opened her mouth, but no words came out. Nearby passengers stared openly. Some shifted in their seats while others stopped pretending not to listen. Tasha maintained her gaze. If you're going to apologize, she said, then say it. You truly did. Miss Parker's lips parted, but her voice faltered. She found herself in uncharted territory, having never navigated this side of a conversation before. She had never needed to justify herself like this, and her hands felt icy. I misjudged you, she finally admitted. Tasha didn't smile or gloat. She simply nodded once and picked up her backpack. The two of them walked back up the aisle together, one in silence, the other burdened by the weight of many observing eyes. As they re-entered the first-class cabin, passengers turned, some looking surprised. Others averted their gaze, feeling a sense of shame. Tasha returned to seat 3B, calmly placing her bag back beneath her feet. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and stared straight ahead. Miss Parker stood beside her, uncertain of what to say next. If there's anything you need, she mumbled, please let me know. Tasha opened her book without looking up. The conversation had come to an end. Ms. Carter turned and walked back up the aisle, her face flushed, her steps quick and uneven. She vanished into the galley like a shadow slipping out of sight. An unusual silence enveloped the first-class cabin, with passengers deliberately avoiding eye contact with Tasha. Their unspoken words conveyed everything. She sensed a change not only in the flight, but also in how she was perceived. Just a few hours earlier, she had gone unnoticed, but now their furtive glances were unmistakable as they feigned indifference. Tasha reclined in her seat and inhaled deeply. The pressure in her chest remained, but it had transformed. The fear had dissipated, giving way to something more profound. Control. Not the loud kind, but a quiet, unwavering strength. She opened her book once more, gazing at the page, though her mind was elsewhere. Across the aisle, a man in a navy blue blazer cleared his throat and leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw what happened earlier, he said. Tasha didn't shift her gaze. Her eyes remained fixed on the page. Did you? He nodded uncomfortably. It was unfortunate. She finally glanced up, one eyebrow arched, and remarked, Unfortunate? He shifted in his seat, acknowledging, Yes, well, clearly a misunderstanding. She studied him for a moment before offering a small, measured smile. You mean it was a choice? The man opened his mouth, then closed it again, his fingers tightening around the armrest as he gradually leaned back into his seat, remaining silent. Tasha returned to her book, flipping the page despite not having finished the previous one. Her phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced at it to see another message from Evelyn. Sit back and relax, I'm not done yet. She didn't reply. Instead, she turned the phone face down and let out a slow breath. In the galley, Ms. Carter leaned over the counter, gripping it tightly with both hands. Her breathing was shallow and her mind was racing. She had escorted passengers off before, dealt with irate customers, dismissed complaints, and enforced rules without hesitation. Yet none of those instances haunted her like this one already was. This time, she hadn't merely removed someone from a seat. She had unveiled something far more disturbing, and now she felt the weight of scrutiny from her fellow flight attendant. Louise entered the galley, and he remained silent at first, just gazing at her for a moment. Finally, he broke the silence, saying, You really messed up. He said Monsieur Parker didn't respond. She's not just some kid, Daniel added. Do you know who her godmother is? I know now, she muttered, her throat dry. Daniel folded his arms. Then you understand this won't end with just an apology. Ms. Carter turned her head slightly, her eyes vacant. I did what I thought was right. No, he replied softly. You did what you assumed. She averted her gaze, her jaw tightening. Back in the first-class cabin, Tasha took another sip of water. The silence around her had shifted. It was no longer dismissive, but laden with discomfort. Everyone was aware of what had transpired. Everyone had witnessed her treatment, and now they were confronted with the reality that they had remained silent. None of them had spoken up. Tasha felt no anger now. She was observing. She realized this was just the beginning. The plane remained stationary. Passengers started to pick up on the absence of the usual mechanical sounds that indicated pushback. No engine roar, no announcements regarding takeoff, only silence interrupted by soft murmurs and frustrated sighs. A few passengers pressed the call buttons, while an elderly man took out his earbuds and looked out the window, puzzled. A woman with a tablet whispered something to herself and caught Louise's attention as he walked by. Is there a delay? She inquired. Daniel nodded, informing us that we needed to wait at the gate a little longer. The captain would provide an update soon. He smiled politely and continued on his way, but the concern in his eyes contradicted the calmness of his words. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the instrument panel he wasn't permitted to touch. The call from the FAA still resonated in his mind. Carolyn Hayes herself had insisted on answers, and when someone of her stature spoke, people paid attention. The tough decisions were not being made by the airlines. The customer support team was no longer involved. The directives were coming directly from the Aviation Authority. Moments later, the in-flight phone buzzed again, and he answered promptly. The voice on the other end was steady yet authoritative. Captain Sullivan, we have received further instructions from FAA operations. He responded, go ahead. The situation had been escalated. You are not cleared for departure. The passenger in question has been returned to her seat, but a compliance officer will meet the aircraft upon landing. You are to keep thorough records of crew actions. A passenger reported during the flight that the captain blinked. The FAA is dispatching someone to meet us. That's accurate. This situation has escalated beyond an internal complaint and is now classified as a priority incident. The crew member involved will be interviewed right after we land. The line fell silent as Captain Sullivan gently set the receiver down and turned to look at the cabin door. He had flown senators, CEOs, and foreign diplomats, but he had never experienced a flight being held up for one girl in seat 3B. Back in the galley, Miss Parker stood still, enveloped in silence. The noise around her was more intense than anything she had ever experienced. Mid-air, her stomach churned. She had dealt with passenger complaints before, people dissatisfied with the food, frustrated by delays, upset about not receiving an upgrade. But this felt different. This wasn't just a complaint, it was a consequence. She ventured into the aisle once more, striving to keep her composure, but the heaviness in her chest was increasing. Her gaze drifted toward first class, where Tasha sat composed, her legs crossed at the ankle and hands resting on her lap. She wasn't smiling, she was simply there. As she gazed back, her mere presence felt more unsettling. Ms. Carter began to move forward, but halted when Louise stepped into her way. He leaned in closer, speaking softly so only she could hear. They just called from the flight deck. The FAA is sending someone to meet us when we land. Her eyes widened. What? You heard me, Louise replied. You're going to have to explain everything to them. Miss Parker's breath caught as she apologized and returned to her seat. Daniel remained unfazed. That's not what this is about anymore. Miss Parker stepped back as if she had been pushed, her mind racing through all the years she had dedicated to her promotions, the reputation she had cultivated as someone who maintained order in the cabin. It had never occurred to her that a single choice, a moment of assumption, could jeopardize it all. But now she felt it slipping away in her mind. She replayed the moment repeatedly, the raised voice, the dismissive tone, the hasty decision to remove Tasha without consulting the manifest. At the time, it had seemed like standard procedure. Now it appeared to be something far more troubling: discrimination, bias, abuse of authority. Terms she never thought would be associated with her name were now looming like dark shadows. Daniel lowered his voice one final time, warning her, "They're going to ask you why you didn't question anyone else. Be prepared." He walked away, leaving Miss Parker standing alone in the aisle, feeling the weight of the passenger's stares. Pierced through her, she had lost control. The uniform that once symbolized her authority now felt like a target on her back. Ahead, Tasha remained quiet. Her silence spoke volumes. The captain's voice crackled through the cabin speakers, calm and rehearsed, yet heavy enough to command attention. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have been advised to delay our departure due to a necessary compliance check. We apologize for the inconvenience. Thank you for your patience. We will begin as soon as we receive clearance from ground control. There was a moment of silence, a few murmurs, and some sighs, but the true nature of this compliance check remained unclear to everyone. Tasha remained still, her gaze unwavering, though her heart raced. The situation was shifting. Her godmother didn't issue threats. She made choices. This was no longer merely about an apology. Something more significant was unfolding. She reached into her bag and retrieved her phone, another message illuminating the screen. Evelyn, the FAA board has identified the flight, and they are documenting every action taken by the crew. If anything else occurs, inform me right away. Tasha read the message, then switched off the screen and carefully set the phone back in her lap. She no longer felt fear. She was observing, absorbing, and prepared. In the galley, Ms. Carter paced anxiously, her palms sweaty and the knot in her stomach tightening with each passing moment. She had hoped the captain's announcement would bring some calm, but instead, it only thickened the tension in the air, causing her thoughts to race. She would likely claim that she believed the girl was in the wrong seat, that she was merely following orders, and that it was an honest mistake. However, none of those excuses would be credible, especially with witnesses present, the captain having communicated directly with the FAA and her being the sole crew member to confront that particular passenger. Daniel leaned into the galley once more. "You should go sit down before you faint," he said bluntly. "I'm fine," she retorted, though her voice betrayed her. "No, you're not. I've been in this job long enough to understand that this situation won't just fade away. You should start preparing for what you'll say when we land, as someone in a suit will undoubtedly want an explanation for why you removed a teenager from a first-class seat." "I didn't remove her. You embarrassed her," Daniel interjected. "And you're only regretting it now because someone significant took notice." The words struck deeper than she anticipated, causing her to look away. Daniel chose not to say anything further. He simply walked out, leaving her in the silence at the front of the cabin. Passengers began to murmur once more as the delay dragged on. One woman stood to use the restroom and walked past Tasha's seat. She paused briefly, making eye contact, her expression conveying more than words ever could. I noticed but remained silent, fully aware of my inaction. Tasha held her gaze for just a moment before turning her focus back to the window. Outside, the ground crew moved at a sluggish pace, awaiting clearance that still hadn't arrived. Inside, the tension escalated with each passing second, particularly for the man in seat 2C, a marketing executive. With an expensive watch and a trembling leg, he finally addressed the woman beside him. "They must be checking the plane." She shook her head slightly. "It's not the plane." "What else could it be?" he inquired. She hesitated before nodding toward Tasha. "It's her." He followed her gaze, his expression tightening with the realization that she was the reason for the delay. The woman added, "You didn't see what the flight attendant did earlier, did you?" He looked guilty. "No, I was on a call." She lowered her voice. "Well, you missed something ugly with the passengers." We were starting to realize that this situation was not about mechanics or technology. It was deeply personal. It was being managed by someone with the authority to immobilize an entire aircraft. Tasha had transformed from the girl who had been sent to the back of the plane. She was no longer anxious or bewildered. She was composed, steady, much like the plane itself. Meanwhile, Ms. Carter was unraveling behind the curtain. The silence she had relied on to command passengers for years now enveloped her, and it had never felt more deafening. The tension was palpable. Inside the cabin, tension mounted with each passing minute. What had begun as a routine flight now resembled a courtroom, silent, charged, and poised for a verdict. Tasha remained still, her posture composed, shoulders squared, legs unmoving. She wasn't attempting to project power. She simply refused to appear diminished. In the galley, Miss Parker occupied a metal jump seat, elbows resting on her knees, forehead cradled in one palm. She hadn't glanced at the time or spoken to anyone since Louise had walked away. Her thoughts echoed like a broken recording in her mind. Fragments of conversations replayed in her mind, her own voice resonating back at her. "Where are your parents? You don't belong here. Move to the back." She had spoken those words aloud in front of others without a second thought. At that moment, it felt empowering, but now it seemed like a record of her past. Finally, she raised her gaze when the phone near the galley buzzed. A crew member answered and handed it to her with a fleeting look. Miss Parker pressed it to her ear, and the voice on the other end was calm and unfamiliar. "This is Ethan Walsh, senior investigator with the FAA, Miss Parker." Her throat constricted as she heard, "Yes, we've received your name in a report regarding an incident on Flight 263. I must inform you that upon landing, you will be taken to a separate area for formal questioning." Miss Parker remained silent. "This is not optional," the voice continued. "Please refrain from speaking further with the involved passenger. Any additional remarks may be noted in the investigation record." She nodded, though he couldn't see her, and whispered, "Understood." The line disconnected. She placed the phone down gently and leaned back against the wall. Exhaling a breath she hadn't known she was holding, her hands trembled uncontrollably. A shudder that originated in her chest and radiated outward unexpectedly. This was not a moment of correction. It felt like an investigation. Throughout the cabin, passengers began to whisper with newfound intensity. A palpable shift had occurred. Something significant. Some quietly pieced together the unfolding situation, while others remained rigid in their seats, praying they wouldn't be questioned about what they had witnessed or neglected to act upon. Daniel made his way past first class once more, and he glanced at Tasha. She met his gaze momentarily before turning her attention back to the window. He remained silent, not uttering a word, but his quiet demeanor conveyed a deep respect. Neither pity nor sympathy, just a subtle recognition of someone who had faced challenges without complaint. Up front, the cockpit door swung open once more as Captain Sullivan emerged, making his way slowly down the aisle toward the galley. He paused in front of Ms. Carter, his expression inscrutable. "They'll be meeting us on the tarmac. Security will escort you first," he stated. She nodded, her gaze remaining fixed. He mentioned that a complete statement was required from all cabin crew, as well as from passengers seated nearby. "I understand," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," he said, then turned to leave. He paused briefly and added, "I suggest you consider your words carefully." As he walked away, Miss Parker sank deeper into her seat, each passing second feeling like an eternity. Meanwhile, in seat 3B, Tasha checked her phone once more. A new message appeared. "Evelyn, FAA, security will meet the plane. You'll be the last to leave. Just stay put." She typed a brief response. "I'm fine. Just observing." She was indeed watching, the subtle exchanges, the heavy silence that shifted from her shoulders to those of her fellow passengers. She noticed Ms. Carter unraveling behind the curtain she once managed. This was not a tantrum or an act of revenge. It was accountability cloaked in silence. As the plane remained stationary on the ground, it became increasingly evident to everyone aboard that this was more than a mere delay. It was a moment of justice. The cabin held an eerie stillness as the plane continued to sit idle. Frozen at the gate, the familiar sounds of takeoff, the engine's rumble, the flight crew's upbeat announcements, the reassuring thud of wheels retracting from the bridge, were absent. Each minute on the tarmac felt elongated, amplifying the unsettling realization that something more grave was occurring. Tasha remained motionless, her phone lying face down on her tray table. She had stopped scrolling, stopped messaging. It was unnecessary. Every fiber of her being sensed the change in the environment, as the same passengers who had previously overlooked her now sat in a state of tension. They exchanged uncomfortable glances, fully conscious of her presence and unable to act as if she wasn't there. The man who had previously deemed the delay unfortunate now completely averted his eyes from her. Even the woman next to him sat with her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her tablet screen untouched. The silence was not merely awkward, it was oppressive, revealing, and no one dared to break it. At the back of the plane, Miss Parker remained in the galley, frozen in place, her breathing shallow as she repeatedly glanced at the curtain, contemplating whether to step forward. She moved back through it or faded behind it, her hands clammy, her thoughts spiraling endlessly. 10 years, that was the duration she had donned that uniform. A decade filled with flight hours, promotions, and control. She had trusted her instincts, believing that a mere glance could reveal the nature of a passenger. What she failed to recognize until now was that those same instincts had guided her directly into the gravest error of her life. She thought she was safeguarding order, but in truth she was merely shielding her own assumptions. Daniel returned to the galley, arms crossed. He remained silent for a moment, observing her. Miss Parker turned to face him, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're going to fire me, aren't they?" Daniel neither nodded nor shook his head. He simply replied, "I don't know." She leaned against the wall, gazing past him. "I've put in too much effort for it to conclude like this." "Perhaps you should have examined her ticket more closely," he said softly. "Or maybe just treated her like a human being." She flinched. "It didn't feel this way before." Daniel tilted his head. "That's because no one has ever confronted you before." She turned away, biting her lip. In first class, the atmosphere changed again when the cockpit door opened once more. The co-pilot entered the aisle, leaned toward the nearest crew member, and whispered something. The flight attendant nodded and approached the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for your continued patience. We have received clearance to start boarding procedures for the next flight shortly. In the meantime, we will be preparing the cabin for disembarkation. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." However, this announcement felt different. The emphasis on the word disembarkation left many passengers puzzled, as they were still at the gate and no one had moved. Tasha turned her head slightly and noticed it as well from the galley. Ms. Carter stiffened. She understood precisely what that meant. The announcement indicated that the flight was not departing. It was concluding. Outside the aircraft, a dark vehicle approached the gate. It was not the typical luggage cart or food service truck, but rather a black SUV with tinted windows and government plates. Beside it stood two uniformed security officers, one representing the airline and the other from the FAA. Inside, Captain Sullivan received the final confirmation through his headset and turned to his co-pilot, nodding once. They were prepared to board. At the rear of the plane, Ms. Carter leaned. Leaning heavily against the counter, her knees buckling, Daniel stole another glance at her but remained silent. There was nothing more to say. In seat 3B, Tasha checked her phone once more as a final message from Evelyn came through. "Security is boarding now. Stay seated. Don't speak unless asked. You've already said enough." And she had, without shouting, without demanding, without ever raising her voice. Tasha hadn't sought attention, yet now the entire plane was focused on her, and the one person who had attempted to silence her was about to be confronted. Announced in front of the crowd, the cabin door opened with a quiet click, yet the energy it emitted was anything but insignificant. Every head in the front rows instinctively turned toward the sound as two figures emerged onto the aircraft. A tall woman in a black FAA uniform, her expression inscrutable, and a clean-shaven man in a dark suit with a badge affixed to his jacket. Neither smiled nor uttered a word as they strode purposefully past the business class rows and into the core of first class. Passengers were left wondering who they were. They sensed it. This was no ordinary situation. It wasn't merely a lost bag or a maintenance concern. It carried a weightier significance, something official. Tasha remained still, observing their approach from the corner of her eye, her expression unchanged. No fear, no satisfaction, just a calm demeanor. The FAA officer halted at her row and looked down. "Miss Holloway?" she inquired. Tasha turned her head slowly and nodded. "My name is Officer Bennett. I am here on behalf of Director Brooks. We will be escorting you off the plane shortly. You will be the last." "To disembark? Is that understood?" Tasha replied, her voice unwavering. The man in the suit interjected, "We will also be detaining a crew member for questioning. Please remain seated until we call for you." With that, they turned and made their way toward the galley. The passengers in the back rows leaned forward, and the whispers started almost instantly. They nudged one another, eyes wide, murmuring questions. Who was she? What did she do? What actions did the flight crew take? Moments later, the answer emerged from the galley, her face devoid of color. Miss Parker moved slowly, accompanied by an airline supervisor and a uniformed security guard. Though she wasn't in handcuffs, it felt as if she were. The silence that enveloped her was oppressive. Every eye in first class was fixed on her. The woman who had raised her voice just hours earlier now avoided all contact, her lips pressed tightly together and her eyes focused straight ahead. As she passed Tasha, she hesitated for a brief moment, turning her head to meet the girl's gaze for the first time since she had sent her away, her eyes trembling. To the rear of the aircraft, yet Tasha remained unfazed. Her expression was neither one of anger nor forgiveness, but rather a cold, unsettling calm. Ms. Carter averted her gaze and continued on, while the passengers remained silent. No applause, no cheers, just a heavy shame that echoed louder than any ovation as she vanished down the aisle. One passenger in business class leaned toward the man next to him and murmured, "She's the reason we never departed the gate." Another person remarked, "She has completely derailed her career." In the galley, Miss Parker was escorted to the front door, stepping off the aircraft as the terminal's bright lights cast shadows on her face. Just beyond the glass wall stood a representative from the FAA's compliance division, clipboard in hand and a serious expression on their face. Ms. Carter had always taken pride in her punctuality, her composure, and her ability to avoid being the issue. But now she had become the issue, and there would be no discreet departure. Inside the cabin, the intercom buzzed one final time. "Attention, ladies and gentlemen, we will begin disembarkation shortly. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. A member of our team will assist you row by row." The passengers stayed in their seats, some feeling uneasy, others intrigued, but all fully aware that what they had experienced was not merely a misunderstanding. It was a public reckoning. Daniel made his way down the aisle and paused beside Tasha. "They'll call you when it's time," he said softly. She nodded in acknowledgement. "I know." He lingered for a moment, as if he had more to say, but ultimately he simply nodded in respect and walked away. Tasha reclined in her seat, the plane nearly vacant now, save for her and a few remaining crew members. The curtain had been drawn back, revealing the hidden truths. She hadn't raised her voice or issued threats. There was no need. One call, one undeniable truth, and the entire flight was halted, not due to turbulence, but because a system that had long ignored too many voices was finally compelled to pay attention. The last of the passengers were escorted off, row by row. The soft shuffle of footsteps reverberated through the now half-empty aircraft. Most passengers kept their gazes lowered, awkward and uncertain. The earlier confidence they had upon boarding completely vanished. Not a single individual found the courage to address Tasha, not even those who had silently observed her humiliation. Yet their silence now felt distinctly different, an acknowledgement not of pity or guilt, but of the unsettling realization that they had witnessed an injustice and chosen inaction. That kind of silence bore a heavy significance. Tasha remained seated in 3B, her with her hands folded in her lap and the tray table still down. Her phone lay on top, its screen dark. She glanced at it once more. No new messages, not that any were necessary. Evelyn had assured her she would handle everything, and she had. Through the open curtain, Tasha caught sight of part of the jet bridge, where a line of suited officials and staff waited beyond it, some representing the airline, others the FAA. Below the terminal window, a black SUV remained parked, its headlights dim against the concrete, a clear indication that this flight would not be overlooked. Inside the cabin, Captain Sullivan stood by the cockpit door with his arms crossed, observing the final moments unfold. He had remained mostly silent during the flight, yet he had been attentive. Now, as he glanced at the girls still seated in first class, he realized something significant. This would alter their operations. Lewis re-entered the cabin, accompanied by Officer Rhodes, who followed closely behind him. "Miss Holloway," she said, her tone both respectful and direct, "we're ready for you." Tasha rose slowly, taking her time without a glance around. She retrieved her bag from beneath the seat, slung it over her shoulder, and cast one final look at the cabin where it all began. She had boarded quietly, adhered to the rules, and taken her seat without causing a stir. Yet for that, she had been stripped of her dignity, challenged, and compelled to shrink away, to vanish. But she hadn't. She had stood her ground without raising her voice, and now she walked out not merely as a passenger, but as the reason Flight 263 would be etched in the industry's memory. As she approached the galley, Louis stepped aside, his voice gentle. "You managed that better than most adults would." Tasha nodded slightly. "I didn't come to fight. I just came to fly." Daniel remained silent. There was no need for further words. She moved through the aircraft door and onto the jet bridge, feeling the immediate temperature change, yet she didn't flinch. On both sides, airline staff and compliance officers remained motionless as she walked by. No one obstructed her path or raised any questions. They simply stepped aside, as if they were already aware of her identity. At the end of the walkway, Evelyn stood waiting. No badge, no clipboard, no entourage, just a composed woman in a navy trench coat and black heels. Her posture was straight, and her expression was inscrutable. Tasha maintained her pace, approaching her and halting. "You all right?" Evelyn inquired. "I'm fine," Tasha replied. "You want to talk about it?" Tasha shook her head once. "Not yet." Evelyn nodded, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did exactly what you needed to do." They turned together and started walking down the terminal, distancing themselves from the crowd, the officers and the murmurs behind them. Inside a small security room just off the gate, Miss Parker sat at a metal desk under bright lights. Across from her, an FAA investigator read aloud from a file. "Flight 263, you removed a minor with a valid boarding pass from her assigned seat without verifying with ground control or the flight manifest." "That's right," Miss Parker's voice trembled. "What prompted you to question her in particular?" The investigator's pen lingered above the paper in silence. "I asked you a question," he reiterated, his tone steady yet assertive. Miss Parker hesitated, her words escaping as a mere whisper. She hardly resembled a first-class passenger. There it was, the unvarnished truth. The investigator's pen began to move. Inside the terminal, Evelyn and Tasha entered, while people flowed past them, oblivious, their faces glued to phones and flight displays. Yet in one corner at the airport, a group of executives was meticulously examining footage, policy documents, and statements from all passengers on board. This incident would not be overlooked, and Tasha was acutely aware of it. She didn't merely reclaim her seat. She compelled the entire airline to confront its responsibilities, not through noise or intimidation, but through honesty. Later that evening, within the headquarters of the airline's main terminal, a private meeting room was illuminated by gentle overhead lights. Yet the polished glass walls did little to conceal the palpable tension around the large table. The members of the airline's executive board, including legal advisors, operations managers, human resources leaders, and the chief executive officer, William Pierce, were gathered. Each had a substantial folder before them, containing written testimonies from crew members, statements from passengers, the captain's in-flight report, and, crucially, the official FAA compliance file. The atmosphere in the room was hushed, punctuated only by the soft rustling of pages and the rare exhale of disbelief. This incident had already captured the attention of internal media teams and one communications department. The advisor finally remarked, "And believe me, it won't remain internal for long." The CEO paused, tapping a pen against the table, his eyes fixed on the printed photo attached to the front of the report. Ms. Carter in uniform, standing stiffly near the galley. "She was one of our longest-serving crew members," he said deliberately, "with no major incidents and no recorded complaints." The director of passenger affairs responded, "She forcibly removed a 16-year-old girl from first class after merely glancing at a valid boarding pass. No scan, no manifest check, just her assumption." The room fell silent, and the CEO continued, "This girl isn't just any passenger. She's the goddaughter of Carolyn Hayes, the Director of Aviation Safety, one of the most esteemed figures in FAA leadership. This isn't merely bad luck. It's a glaring example of institutional failure strutting around in heels. A senior advisor cleared her throat and began a new document. We have examined the internal footage from the cabin. While the audio wasn't recorded, the behavior of the passengers supports the account. No other first-class passengers were questioned. None at all. Ms. Holloway never raised her voice or resisted. Another board member leaned in, stating, "We have a narrow opportunity to address this before it escalates into national news." The CEO nodded slowly, and regarding Ms. Carter, she has been suspended without pay pending a formal disciplinary review. Legal counsel has confirmed the FAA is involved, anticipating complete collaboration, yet the evidence suggests that reinstatement is improbable. There were no objections as the board commenced drafting an internal memorandum detailing a set of immediate changes, including mandatory bias training for all flight crews, stricter seat verification rules, a new protocol for addressing complaints involving minors, and a direct reporting channel between the airline and the FAA for incidents of discrimination. "This story is bound to become public," one advisor remarked. "When it does, we need more than just a press release," the CEO acknowledged. "We won't merely apologize, we'll demonstrate that we've made real changes throughout the city." In a serene hotel suite with a view of the runway, Evelyn sat on the couch, her laptop open, her coat draped over the back of a chair, and her shoes were discarded near the door. On her screen, she was reviewing an early draft of the policy proposal she had started preparing. She had witnessed too many reports like this. Quiet stories buried in folders, victims forgotten the moment they disembarked from a plane. But this time, it was different. Someone she cherished, and that altered everything for her. Tasha sat nestled in an armchair, draped in an oversized hoodie, holding a steaming cup of tea. The silence enveloping them was gentle and soothing. "You don't have to face all of that tonight," Tasha remarked after a moment. Evelyn offered a faint smile. "I'm not tired," she replied. Tasha looked down at her cup. "You always said change takes time." "It is," Evelyn remarked, turning her gaze back to the screen. "But sometimes when someone is courageous enough to speak up, even softly, it can hasten things a bit." Tasha hesitated before responding. "I didn't feel courageous." "You didn't need to," Evelyn assured her. "You only had to speak the truth, and you did." Tasha reclined her head against the chair, gazing out the window. Below, lights sparkled on the tarmac as another plane ascended, its nose rising steadily into the night sky. Inside, someone else was flying quietly, blissfully unaware, reflecting on how near they were to being cast aside, to facing judgment, to feeling unwelcome. Perhaps due to the events of today, they would no longer be dismissed. Tasha sipped her tea, closing her eyes as the warmth enveloped her chest. An apology was no longer necessary. She didn't crave headlines. What truly mattered was unfolding. Transformations were in progress. Awareness had been ignited. The flight hadn't departed, but something else had taken off, this time buoyed by truth rather than hindered by power. The following morning, the story emerged. It began subtly with a brief article on an aviation blog published at dawn. The headline was straightforward: FAA grounds flight over passenger complaint. Airline confirms internal review. At first glance, it appeared to be typical travel news, but nestled within the article was a line that would spark significant controversy. Sources revealed that the passenger in question was a black teenage girl who had been unjustly removed from her designated first-class seat by a senior flight attendant. FAA officials expressed grave concerns about discriminatory behavior in this incident. At 55 minutes and 17 seconds, the story gained traction as major media outlets began to cover it. Industry reporters sought confirmation, and one regional news station aired a segment before lunchtime. By noon, the airline's public relations team had released a meticulously crafted statement. "We are aware of an incident on Flight 263 involving a crew member and a first-class passenger. We are conducting a thorough investigation in collaboration with the Federal Aviation Authority. Discrimination of any kind contradicts our values, and the crew member has been placed on immediate suspension. We are currently assessing our training and internal protocols to prevent a recurrence of this incident." However, by mid-afternoon, video clips from passengers started to circulate on social media. Some had recorded the moment M. Parker was escorted off the plane. One particular 15-second video depicted Tasha walking calmly down the jet bridge, with a security officer trailing a few steps behind. The video was silent, showcasing a line of shocked faces observing her departure. The clip went viral, attracting thousands of comments, some expressing outrage while others conveyed heartbreak. Many individuals were weary, fatigued by the repetition of similar narratives. Different names, different faces, yet the same pattern. A young black person faced questioning and humiliation, made to feel as though they did not belong. This time, however, the story did not conclude with a public apology. Instead, someone halted the entire plane and the world took notice. Concurrently, in a conference room at the FAA's regional office, Miss Parker sat opposite two compliance officers and an airline attorney. Her uniform was absent. She wore a simple blouse, her hair pulled back, and her eyes appeared hollow, a recorder in hand. Sat at the center of the table, diligently recording every word. One officer inquired, "Can you verify that you approached the passenger in seat 3B without any request from the manifest ground agents or another crew member?" Miss Parker gave a slight nod and replied, "Yes, why?" "I believe she was out of place," she remarked. "I thought there must have been an error. Did you confirm that?" Number. The officer leaned in, asking, "What was it about her that led you to believe she didn't belong?" Ms. Carter remained silent, the stillness amplifying each passing second, as if it carried its own weight of judgment. The officer spoke softly, emphasizing the essence of the investigation, the pivotal moment, the decision at hand. Ms. Carter swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on her hands. "I've been here for a decade," she murmured. "I've witnessed people slip into first class before. I believed I was upholding order." "You weren't," the officer replied. "You were upholding an assumption," added the lawyer beside her. There was nothing to be done, and she understood that a memo wouldn't resolve the situation, nor would an apology suffice. The girl hadn't raised her voice, hadn't violated any rules, nor had she attempted to deceive anyone. She simply occupied the seat her godmother had purchased. Yet that alone had sparked uncertainty, which now ignited a nationwide reaction. At that very moment, airline personnel were being summoned for urgent training sessions. Flight crews were seated in rows, absorbing new compliance videos on discrimination and bias, and pilots were receiving updated manuals. The internal newsletters featured a firm message from the CEO: "We must improve, and we must do it now." Back in the hotel suite, Tasha browsed her phone, absorbing the headlines, tweets, and messages. Reactions varied. Some expressed anger, others offered gratitude, some called her brave, while a few inquired about her next steps. Yet she sought no spotlight. She never desired any of this. All she wanted was to take her place like everyone else. Evelyn entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You're trending," she remarked, placing one down. Tasha remained focused on her phone. Evelyn paused, observing Tasha. "You all right?" Tasha nodded. "It's just strange seeing people write about you as if they truly know you." Evelyn, sitting across from her, replied, "They don't need to know you. They only need to understand what happened and why it was significant." Tasha finally met her gaze, asking, "Do you think it will change anything?" Evelyn hesitated, taking a sip of her coffee before responding. "It already has, and it has." The headlines may eventually diminish, and the media might shift its focus, but the policy reforms, the training initiatives, and the discussions taking place within the corridors of power will endure. This is because a reserved girl on a plane chose not to remain unnoticed, and now no one could turn a blind eye. By the week's end, the story had captured the attention of every major news outlet. National broadcasts debated it during primetime. Civil rights organizations issued statements, hashtags surged on social media, and schools engaged in discussions about it in classrooms, while employees in airports across the nation murmured about it. Break rooms referred to it not by flight number, but by the nickname, the Grounded Girl. It wasn't merely the headlines that resonated. It was the profound silence surrounding the event. The girl had neither argued nor resisted. She hadn't raised her voice. Instead, she simply spoke the truth, remained seated, and made one call. That was what surprised everyone. How someone so young and composed could bring an entire airline to a standstill with nothing but quiet dignity and facts. News programs replayed footage of her walking down the jet bridge, while podcasts analyzed the timeline. An op-ed in the New York Times published an article titled, "She Didn't Belong or You Didn't Want Her to." This prompted individuals to reflect within their own homes, questioning whether they would have spoken up if they were on that flight, why no one confronted the flight attendant, and how often such incidents occur without public scrutiny. However, it wasn't only society that was observing. The airline was also under the spotlight. Faced with public pressure and FAA oversight, an internal overhaul was initiated, leading to Ms. Carter's suspension being converted into a permanent termination, followed by a formal announcement, highlighted a blatant infringement on passenger rights and corporate ethics. A name that was once held in high regard within aviation now bore a legacy that no one wished to associate with. At corporate offices, bias training transitioned from an annual requirement to a monthly interactive and monitored program. A new whistleblower policy was introduced to safeguard both passengers and crew who reported instances of discrimination. Additionally, boarding procedures underwent revisions, implementing a two-step verification process to ensure staff did not question passengers based solely on their appearance. Airline unions, once silent, began to present their own proposals, marking the start of a subtle transformation aimed not only at preserving their reputation, but also at restoring trust. As the airline worked to redefine its image, a distinct wave of change resonated with the public. Tasha emerged as a symbol, not a traditional hero in a cape or a vocal advocate, but something even more impactful, a testament to the idea that dignity can be steadfast without being ostentatious. Schools sought her out for speaking engagements. Advocacy groups invited her to participate in discussions, and journalists clamored for interviews. However, she declined most of these opportunities. She aspired to represent a cause, but her main desire was to reclaim her life. One evening, Tasha and Evelyn found themselves at a modest community hall where local teens came together for their weekly mentoring sessions. It wasn't a media event, no cameras, no speeches, just a space filled with young girls seeking genuine answers. One girl, no older than 15, raised her hand and asked, "Were you scared?" She inquired, and Tasha glanced at her for a brief moment before nodding. "Yeah, a little." The girl leaned in and asked, "So how did you manage to stay calm?" Tasha smiled softly, knowing she hadn't done anything wrong and feeling the support of someone by her side. The room fell silent, and Evelyn, sitting just behind her, offered a subtle nod of pride. This was the aspect many overlooked, the power of belief and the strength that comes not only from within, but also from the assurance that someone outside would stand up for you. After the session, as the girls laughed and took photos with her, one of the organizers pulled Evelyn aside. "She doesn't realize it yet," the woman remarked, softly, "but she's already accomplished more for them than we have in years." Evelyn looked at Tasha, who was surrounded by cheerful faces. Tasha had expressed that she didn't want to be a symbol. She simply desired fairness. The woman responded, "That's precisely why she's the right choice." Later that evening, in the stillness of their apartment, Evelyn set a small envelope on Tasha's nightstand. Inside was a handwritten letter from the FAA, an official commendation acknowledging her dignity, poise, and integrity displayed under pressure. The note at the bottom was penned by Evelyn herself. "You didn't raise your voice, yet you were heard more clearly than many ever are. I take pride in you because you didn't merely reclaim your seat. You reminded the world of your rightful place in it." Tasha sat on her bed, reading those words repeatedly. As she leaned back against the pillow, her eyes heavy with contemplation, she understood that although the flight may never have departed, her voice resonated far beyond that moment. Weeks went by, the media shifted focus to newer stories, and airports returned to their usual bustle. The familiar hustle of passengers with rolling luggage and quick announcements filled the air. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Flights boarded, seats occupied, and planes departed. However, beneath this routine, a change had occurred within the airline's headquarters. A new training video was incorporated into the onboarding process. It was neither dramatic nor promotional, Rather, it presented a clear and calm reenactment of Flight 263. At the conclusion, a slide emerged on the screen. A valid ticket does not seek approval. Respect is not determined by appearance. Bias has no place on board. It became essential to confront the reality of what had occurred, as it had left an indelible impact that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, in a modest high school auditorium 3 states away, a teacher took a moment to pause her class and distribute printouts. Today, she announced, we're going to explore the real-world consequences of assumptions and how one teenager compelled a global airline to pay attention. The printout was titled Case Study Flight 263, How One Girl Grounded a System That Refused to Acknowledge Her. Tasha began, gradually returning to her everyday life, free from the glare of cameras and interviews. She felt a sense of relief as the whirlwind of sudden fame faded. She continued to take the bus as she always did, walking with her earbuds in and her hoodie pulled over her head, remaining unnoticed and blending in with the crowd. Yet there were subtle shifts in her reality. On a routine flight to visit her aunt, a flight attendant approached her with a warm smile. "Hi there," the woman said softly. "I just wanted to let you know that we read your story in training." Tasha glanced up, taken aback, as the woman offered a genuine smile this time. "I just want you to know, it made a difference for me and for many of us." Tasha nodded softly, uncertain of how to respond, and simply said, "Thank you." The woman continued on, leaving a warmth in the silence rather than a chill. On that flight, no one questioned her seat, no one asked for her ticket twice, and no one assumed she didn't belong. It was a moment of tranquility. Weeks later, Evelyn stood on a stage at an FAA leadership conference, with the hall filled with hundreds of policymakers, airline executives, and safety experts. The directors and crew leads observed her in a navy suit, her hair neatly pulled back, her voice steady and straightforward. She refrained from mentioning her goddaughter or providing specifics. Instead, she conveyed a clear truth. She addressed the consequences of silent assumptions, emphasizing how even the slightest unchecked power could strip away a person's dignity in an instant. She reminded everyone that those most susceptible to injustice are not always the most vocal, yet they are always attentive. Then she stated, "We discuss turbulence in aviation frequently. We train for storms and prepare for systems. Setbacks, yet the most perilous turbulence, lies not in the clouds but within our judgment. It's the instantaneous choices made without solid evidence that can lead to a system's collapse." The room fell silent as she stepped away. Not from courtesy, but because no one dared to be the first to break the silence after her address. A young flight supervisor approached her softly. "Director Brooks," he said, "that girl from Flight 263, did she ever comprehend the magnitude of this situation?" Evelyn met his gaze with a smile that conveyed both sorrow and understanding, and pride. "She didn't have to," she replied, as she never sought attention. She simply desired to sit in her seat in peace. That yearning for fair treatment is what made that evening so impactful. Tasha sat on the porch with Evelyn, legs curled beneath her, sipping warm cider as the sun set. The world felt quieter now, perhaps safer, if not perfect, at least changed in meaningful ways. "I keep thinking about what that flight attendant said," Tasha murmured. Evelyn turned to her, asking, "Which part?" "That I didn't look like I belonged," Tasha replied. After a moment of waiting, Tasha remarked, "Every time I enter a room, board a plane, or take a seat at a table, I no longer question my place there. I simply sit." Evelyn responded with a gentle smile, her eyes warm. "That's because you've always belonged." Tasha nodded, gazing at the dimming light. She realized she didn't need a stage or revenge. What she possessed now was far more valuable. A seat she no longer had to fight for, and a world that would reconsider. For once, a quiet girl had brought an entire system to a halt. Not through screams or protests, but through her presence. With a single phone call, the truth revealed that the sky had always been accessible to her. Now at last, respect was also within reach, and it would remain open not just for her, but for every traveler who would step onto a plane after her, armed only with a ticket and the inherent right to be treated as if they truly belonged. If this story resonated with you, please remember to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this in the future. The story of Tasha on Flight 263 teaches the power of quiet dignity and the importance of challenging assumptions. Tasha's calm response to injustice, making a single call, halted a flight and exposed bias, showing that courage doesn't require loudness. It underscores that everyone deserves respect, regardless of appearance, and that unchecked assumptions can lead to systemic failure. In today's America, where diversity is celebrated, yet biases persist, this lesson resonates. From workplaces to public spaces, people face snap judgments based on race, age, or status. Tasha's story urges us to verify facts before acting and to advocate for fairness. Applying this, we can foster inclusivity by questioning our biases, listening to marginalized voices, and ensuring equitable treatment. In schools, workplaces, or communities, we must act like Evelyn, supporting those wronged, and not remain silent like the passengers. By embracing accountability and empathy, we build a culture where everyone's seat is secure, reflecting America's values of justice and equality in 2025.